Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Ben. This is the Gibson Les Paul Standard Greeny, and this is the inspired by Gibson custom shop Epiphone Greeny. Let's get into it. Most of you guys know about the infamous Greeny guitar by now, which there's been a ton of videos released about it since the release of this series of guitars. But I'll give you a real quick Cliff Notes version of it about the features that are relevant to this release of these guitars, this being the Gibson USA version and this being the Epiphone version of that guitar. In 1959, Greeny was born out of the Gibson factory. Now, Greeny was originally born as a Cherry Sunburst, and then over the decades, going through the hands of Peter Green of Fleetwood Mac, Gary Moore of Thin Lizzy, and lastly, now in the hands of Kirk Hammett of Metallica, that Cherry Sunburst has turned more into like a Lemon Burst look almost. Now, for the longest time, a lot of people thought the magical sound of Greeny came from the out-of-phase wiring. And yes, while it does have that, at some point Gary Moore took the guitar to one of his techs, who diagnosed one of the pickups and realized that not only was the guitar wired out of phase, but it was magnetically out of phase. And that created the situation that you can really hear this when you're messing around with the volume and tone and bleeding the various out-of-phase components in with each other. I'll put some links to some really good videos about Greeny in the description below, but I think what I gave you is important for this version of Greeny. And I emphasize that because Gibson's already released a $50,000 version, which is more or less a replica of Greeny. They've also released a $20,000 version, which is a lesser replica of Greeny. And back in 2010, they released like a collector's choice version of Greeny as well, which was again, more of a replica. Now these guitars kind of stand on their own, and you can consider them more being inspired by Greeny, and thus that's why I'm comparing these two with each other as opposed to the other ones, because these kind of are more head-to-head models. So on my left, you have the Gibson Kirk Hammett Greeny Les Paul Standard, and on my right, you have the Epiphone Kirk Hammett 1959 Les Paul Standard. And right there's a clue of some of the differences between these guitars. This is more or less just a Les Paul Standard with some Greeny features, whereas the Epiphone is designed in collaboration with the Gibson Custom Shop, inspired by the Custom Shop model, and is more or less a more budget-friendly version of some of the higher-end Greenys. So the price, the Gibson is $3,200. The Epiphone comes in at about $1,500. And that is right, you heard me, $1,500. That pretty much makes this the most expensive foreign-made Epiphone, putting it right on par with the Dave Mustaine Prophecy Flying V. Now, a lot of people are worried if that's going to be the trend for Epiphone, sort of raising their prices to more expensive guitars. I'm not necessarily so sure of that myself. I think when you make a guitar that's inspired by the Gibson Custom Shop and features a lot of same components as the Gibson counterpart, you really can't undercut them too much. I mean, I guess in the end, it's all the same money going to the same company, but you know what I'm saying, I think. Now, each of these guitars has a sort of elephant in the room, and I think with the Gibson, the biggest one that I heard people complaining about or worried about or not satisfied with, very few people seemed happy with this decision, was to make the finish a satin nitrocellulose. And I agree, I think it would have looked better with a gloss, but the current running theory that I see pop up the most is that maybe Gibson did it satin so that the more you play it, the more it wears in, and it sort of creates a life of its own. Kind of like the real Greeny, you can see every wear mark, you know, where something gets repeatedly rubbed against. And I think a good demonstration of that is if you look at this guitar, which is a SG Voodoo that had a satin finish, and I played the crap out of this thing. I mean, you can see the finish is worn off the neck, but you can also see the body where most contact is. It has a little bit of a sheen to it. Pretty much the satin finish is more or less all but gone, and in a lot of places on this guitar, I'd say at this point in time, 90% of the guitar is now like a shiny, glossy polish. Of course, this guitar is pushing 20-something years old. I don't know if I want to wait that long for the Gibson version of the Greeny to look like that, but that's kind of the current running theory. Now, the Epiphone actually has a very similar finish. It's almost identical in terms of the satiny look to it. Of course, it's not nitrocellulose. It is whatever their common poly finish that they use on the Epiphone guitars is. Now, the big elephant in the room for the Epiphone, of course, was the headstock, which everybody's heard about and talked about now. And myself, I'm not so sure why they did it. I'm not even sure if I really like it myself. I mean, aesthetically, I look at the guitar and I think, oh, it's a Gibson Les Paul. And I guess it's not really any different than like the Orville by Gibson guitars from the past, but it just seems like as an Epiphone, it should have its own identity. And again, it's that weird thing where it's still, the same company technically. So I don't know. My jury's out on that. I'll just say that. All right, let's get into the cases for these guitars. So the Gibson comes with a traditional Gibson hardshell brown faux leather case. The logo printed right here on the face. Inside the case, you get the usual plush red interior with a padded block here to accommodate for the neck angle. We open up the pocket, and inside you see a goodie bag. And inside the goodie bag, you get the owner's manual, the warranty card, an advertisement for the Gibson app, the usual Gibson strap, a polishing cloth, a pickguard mounting hardware, despite the fact that the guitar has no holes drilled for such a thing. You get the Gibson tool, the traditional Gibson baby photo, keys to the case, and yes, there's a desiccant pack in there as well. Now for the Epiphone, you also get a faux leather brown case, but I think in this situation it looks maybe a touch more authentic, just a slight bit. When you look at the logo on the front, it says Epiphone, inspired by Gibson Custom. When you open it up, you get a really nice looking pink interior that definitely brings you back to the authentic cases. It's also got the same padded block for the body angle. And inside the pocket, the Epiphone goodie bag, which contains an ad for the Gibson app, a ton of Epiphone stickers, which you guys know how much I love these, the warranty card, a toe tag with some information about the strings, and lastly, keys for the case. As usual, the Epiphone case offerings are a little bit lackluster, and I was at least expecting that they'd throw a strap or something in there, but not this time. Now both of these guitars, of course, have a mahogany body with a maple cap. The Gibson has a AAA flamed top here, and the Epiphone has a AAA flamed veneer on top. Now both of these guitars, of course, have a mahogany body with a maple cap. The Gibson has a AAA figured top. Now I'll say, when I first got the Gibson about 6 months ago, I wasn't too impressed with the way that the body looked. But checking it out now, this is the first time I've probably opened the case in about 6 months. It really has actually a lot more life to it than I remember, almost kind of like those really neat quilted tops that sort of dance in the light. Now the Epiphone has a AAA flamed maple veneer on top. Now if you don't know what a veneer is, imagine you just have a really nice aesthetically pleasing piece of wood and you run it through a deli slicer and you basically make like 100 tiny paper thin cuts of really nice wood and you throw that on top. I've used the analogy before of it being sort of like the icing on a cake, and that's kind of what it pretty much is here. It's a really, 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 really nice outer layer on top of whatever maple was there before. And that's not to say the maple that they used was bad, it just wasn't as nice looking as maybe what you'd get for a price on the Gibson. And if you look at both guitars online, say it's Sweetwater, American Musical, Guitar Center, whatever it is, you'll definitely notice more variation in the tops on the Gibsons as opposed to the Epiphones, which generally have a more uniform look. And that's basically because they can take one really nice piece of wood and cut it into 100 different nearly identical tops and slap it onto their guitars, send out a batch, and maybe Sweetwater's got all 6 of those from that same batch, and the top is going to look really, really, really close. It's very weird looking at this on camera because you can sort of see this cherry sunburst that this is based on. You can really see that it's kind of burnt into the edges here with a really light center, whereas the Epiphone kind of just has one color through and through. And the backside finish on these guitars is also very different. It seems like for the Gibson they were pretty content with going with kind of a real light finish here on the wood, so you get a lot of the wood grain and it sort of just looks like mahogany, whereas the Epiphone has a more traditional reddish finish on the backside, which is actually a lot closer to what Greeny looks like. It's very interesting because on the parts of Greeny that haven't worn through, it looks like this, and the parts on the backside where it has worn through, it looks like this. So maybe they just split the difference and gave one to one guitar and one look to the other guitar. I have no idea. Both these guitars have 50s style profiles. The Gibson says that it's a vintage 50s profile, and the Epiphone says that it has a custom Greeny profile. The guitars both have mahogany necks. I was surprised to find that the Gibson has a short tenon joint, whereas the Epiphone actually does have a long tenon joint. The Gibson has a Indian rosewood fretboard, and the Epiphone has an Indian laurel fretboard. And I don't know if you can see this here, but The Gibson almost has what looks like a pinkish hue to the fretboard. I don't know if I'm a fan of that as much as the Epiphones, which has more of a traditional darker brown look to my eye anyway. When it comes to the measurements, the nut on the Gibson is 1.7 inches, whereas the nut on the Epiphone is a near identical 1.69 inches. Looking at more measurements of the necks here, the Gibson has a 0.84 inch for the first fret, and when we move down to the 12th fret, we're getting a 0.96 inches. The Epiphone, however, has a 0.89 at the first fret and a 1.01 at the 12th fret. Now, you might be wondering, what is the custom Greeny profile? And they don't really tell you that, but just for kicks, I took a measurement at each fret to see if maybe I could find some sort of pattern there, and I actually did. I don't know if this is what they're talking about, but the Gibson basically has a pretty aggressive taper starting at the first fret, going down to about the 5th fret, and then it starts to become a shallower angle, and from about the 8th fret down to just about the beginning of the 13th fret, it's more or less flat, reading at that 0.96 inches, 0.95, 0.96 inches. Whereas the Epiphone pretty much takes a straight line from the first fret all the way down to the beginning of the 13th fret here, where the heel starts. You can actually see an appreciable difference in each fret's thickness. Maybe that's what the custom Greeny profile is. I'm not so sure. I did take other measurements of the neck, and everything else seemed pretty identical. The profile seemed like a rounded D, maybe a soft C sort of look. So that's my guess anyway. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that the Gibson has fret nibs on the neck there, which is pretty standard on a Gibson that has binding, whereas the Epiphone does not have any fret nibs. I don't know if you can tell that, but that is also pretty common for most Epiphone guitars. Now, the Gibson does maintain its usual 17-degree angle back on the headstock, and the Epiphone, even though it does have this Gibson headstock, did maintain the 13-degree angle back. So you can see that it is a much shallower angle there. Moving on to the hardware here, when we move on to the Gibson, you've got your usual advanced plating stop bar here and our Gibson branded ABR1 bridge. Pretty standard for a Les Paul standard these days. In case you're curious, both of these pieces together weigh in at just under 100 grams, at about 98 grams. Moving on to the Epiphone, it's a little bit different. The Epiphone has a Locktone stop bar, and if you don't know what their Locktone brand of stuff is, it's basically that it's got these little metal clips in it, and Epiphone says it's to keep the stop bar locked in to maximize performance and sustain and tone, but I think it's kind of a bunch of hooey, because when you have all the strings strung up, it's about 200 pounds of force that are being pulled together here. I think that's probably pulling this stop bar into these posts more than anything else will. Now, one thing that is nice about the Locktone is you can change your strings without worrying about the stop bar falling off, as demonstrated in this little clip from another video I did a few months ago. Now, usually where there's a Locktone stop bar, there's a Locktone tune-o-matic bridge, but that's where this Epiphone is a little bit different. This bridge has sort of like a hybrid Nashville ABR kind of thing going on. I'm not too sure exactly. So there's some bushing sunk into the body, like you would expect on most Epiphone Les Paul standards. Then there's some screws going into those bushings. Those screws move independently, and usually the bridge is resting on some sort of flat platform that's on those screws, and that's how you adjust your height. However, in this case, the screws can slide up and down in the bushings, but the thumb wheels actually move independently of that other screw as well. So there's, on each side of the bridge, 2 different ways to adjust your height. To me, that seems like one extra moving part. I haven't seen that before, maybe you have. To me, it just seems a little weird. All right, let's take our Epiphone branded stop bar and our B2 bridge and throw them on the scale here, and we can see the reading just under 125 grams there. Moving up the guitar here, we've got our medium jumbo frets, and eventually we land on our tuners. Now, these models have Grover tuners, whereas the real Greeny has Sperzel tuners, as well as the $50,000 and the $20,000 replicas have Sperzel tuners. The difference between these tuners, of course, is Gibson has their usual 14:1 tuning ratio, whereas the Epiphone has an 18:1 tuning ratio, and I'll admit, they actually move pretty smooth. I quite like them. Now the Gibson, of course, has a truss rod, which is accessible underneath the jack plate there, no secret, and the Epiphone has a dual action truss rod, which is pretty common for a lot of Epiphones nowadays, maybe most of them. Now when we drop down to the strap buttons, the Gibson has a mushroom style strap button, which is actually a little bit more in line with what was offered in the 1959 Les Paul. The Epiphone has a flower pot style that Epiphone is known for. Now the Gibson style strap button is actually a lot closer to what was on Greeny before Kirk Hammett put a Schaller strap lock on it. But I guess when you pay about $1 million for a guitar and you're strutting around stage, you probably need a little bit more protection than what this thing offers. Moving on to the electronics of these guitars, it is true they both have Gibson Greeny Bucker branded pickups, and I think for my Gibson and Epiphone reviews, this is the first time both guitars have had identical pickups. Well, let's measure these two sets of pickups and see just how close they are. So starting with the Gibson, we'll move on to the bridge first. We're getting an 8.57, and in the neck, we're getting an 8.11. Moving to the middle, we get a 4.16. Now moving on to the Epiphone, we'll start with the bridge first. We'll get an 8.61, the neck an 8.16, in the middle, we're getting a 4.19. So you can see these are pretty close. That's well within tolerance, and that's pretty usual for two different pickups on two different guitars. When we flip around the backside and get into the control cavity, the Gibson has their usual Gibson audio taper pots for both the volume and tone, and the Epiphone has their CTS pots, which are probably audio taper as well. The Gibson has the orange drop capacitors, whereas the Epiphone has Mallory capacitors. Same value for both. But the Gibson, despite this being a 50s Les Paul, has modern wiring, whereas the Epiphone maintains the 50s wiring. And I think when I plug these guitars up, that's going to be the real difference maker here, is how the different pots with the different caps interact with these pickups. And it'll be an interesting comparison for sure. Now let's start up here at the headstock. Both guitars have their logo inlaid there, which is still trippy on the Epiphone that it looks so much like the Gibson. Now I don't know what material it is, but I can tell you that the Gibson has plastic acrylic inlays and the Epiphone has a mother of pearl set of inlays here, which was surprising to me, and it could possibly be mother of pearl up here at the headstock. I'm not too sure. Both guitars have a Graphtec nut right here. And as mentioned before, both guitars have the usual truss rod covers that are common with each manufacturer. The 2-screw one on the Gibson and the 3-screw that is common with the Epiphone. Moving down to the switch, both guitars have a cream switch tip as well as a cream poker chip. Usually when you buy some of these more unique Gibson guitars, like some of the Slash guitars or the modern guitars, they don't come with a poker chip, but Gibson will throw it in the case and you can install it later at your leisure. Well, this one doesn't say anything, obviously, neither does this one say anything. So I was thinking maybe they would have put one in the case that does say it in case you want to add it later. They did not. Then I got thinking maybe they just installed the poker chip upside down and you could just flip it over if you wanted to see the rhythm and treble text on there. Well, I can save you a lot of time and say, don't take it off. They did not do that. And when you're reinstalling that after you have taken it apart, it can be a real pain in the butt if the little set screw in the switch tip here pops off. Don't do it. Now moving down to the pickups, you can see that they are housed in these cream pickup rings on both guitars. And when we move over to the Gibson, it's interesting because their website says that the knobs here, you've got 2 gold top hat knobs with silver reflectors, which you can see right here. And then it says these other 2 are amber top hat knobs, which is what Greeny has. But these are actually not amber top hat knobs. In fact, they are so similar in color to these gold top hat knobs that I'm curious if it's kind of just the same knob. And you'll see when I pull up the Epiphone here that this is an amber top hat knob. These are the same ones that are on the Gibson, but these are definitely a different color than what you're getting here. And if you look at pictures of Greeny, you can definitely see something that matches this color a little bit more. And I'm willing to bet if this guitar sits around and gets played for about 3 more decades, it'll probably look a lot closer to Greeny than this one will. And lastly, I want to talk about the binding on these guitars. There's not really anything special about the Gibson's binding. It's your usual cream binding that you see on pretty much most of their Les Paul standards. But when we move over to the Epiphone, there's sort of an aged thing going on here with the binding, and I'm not so sure that it actually is working. it kind of just has this really off color that doesn't really quite look aged. It doesn't really look as clean as like a new cream binding. To give you an example, this is my old Epiphone Les Paul. This thing's about 30 years old now. And you can see that the binding has almost taken on this, not quite neon color, but it's almost like an otherworldly sort of shift in the color, whereas the binding on the new Epiphone here doesn't really look aged in comparison. And you'll see this kind of look on a lot of older guitars where the binding sort of takes on this weird hue that's sort of a bright orange, bright white, bright yellow all mixed together. It's a very interesting thing that I've only seen on guitars that are actually old. Now, I did think this was interesting. The Gibson has the black jack plate, and you can see that the Epiphone has a cream jack plate. Now, an interesting bit of history about Greeny is that it started out with a cream jack plate, and at some point it broke, and I think it was Gary Moore that replaced it with a black metal jack plate. Now, this jack plate is plastic, but it does look a little bit more authentic to the real Greeny. And I do think that's kind of an interesting thing, especially for the Epiphone on a guitar, that what I would consider they maybe made more of an effort to make it more like the original Greeny, that they went with the cream jack plate. So I don't really understand that choice, but that's how it is. Now let's talk about the weight of these guitars. The Gibson comes in at a pretty whopping 9.91 pounds. That is substantially heavier than the Epiphone, which is coming in at 8.6 pounds, but is actually a lot closer to what the real Greeny weighs nowadays, which is about 8 pounds 15 ounces. So even though the Gibson is a heavier guitar, the Epiphone actually feels heavier in my hands when I'm playing it. And a lot of that is no doubt because the neck is substantially thicker as well. But here's something that is very interesting. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Gibson was a little bit bigger than the Epiphone in nearly every direction. From here to here, it's about a 1/16 of an inch bigger. From here to here, it's about a 1/16 of an inch bigger. But right here, right where the neck meets this corner here, is the only place that I found on the Epiphone where it's actually thicker on the Epiphone. 2.1 inches here on the Gibson versus 2.2 inches on the Epiphone. Now, you know, 1/10 of an inch doesn't seem like too much of a distance in the scheme of things in the world. But when you're playing a guitar with a neck this thick and you're already stressing to get some of these high notes, you really feel that 1/10 of an inch. Additionally, the scale, and it always is this case on every single Epiphone that I've looked at, is just a touch bigger on the Epiphone than the Gibson, averaging about 1/4 of an inch longer. I doubt anybody's going to feel that when they play it. Time and time again when I've measured these guitars, the Epiphone bodies are always a little bit smaller, but the scale is always a little bit bigger. Now I'm going to do the sound test on both these guitars, and I'll do a neck dive test as well, use the same strap of course. Now I want you to remember the difference between these two guitars really comes down to the capacitors as well as the wiring, because otherwise they more or less have the same tone woods, the same pickups, and you know, it's going to be an interesting test, I think. Let me know what you think in the comments about that too, by the way. Now I'll say both these guitars played great in my hands and they were both set up really good from the factory. I had a little bit of concern that the poly coating on the Epiphone might be a little bit more sticky or a little more friction, but after a few minutes of playing it, it felt great and that wasn't a concern at all. And I would actually say I could play some things on one guitar better than things on the other guitar and vice versa. For example, up here on the higher registry, it was a lot easier to hit these notes than over here where you really feel the thickness of the neck. But then consequently, because I have pretty big fat hands, I was able to do rhythm and stuff on the Epiphone guitar a lot easier than on the Gibson guitar. Maybe not a lot easier for either comparison, but easier in general. Lastly, I'll say this Gibson has crazy sustain. And I'm not saying that all Gibson Greeny, USA standards, whatever, have that sustain. I'm just pointing out that this one particular Greeny is one of those mojo ones that you find, and every once in a while you come across a guitar that has sustain, and this happens to be one of those ones. Not that it's bad on the Epiphone, but it is extraordinary on this guitar. I actually had an SG90 that I bought a few years back, and I always wanted one of them. And for whatever reason, it was just dead. When I would hit a note, it would ring out for like 2 seconds and then just die. And I actually got rid of the guitar because of that. This is the exact opposite of that. I know that's a bit of a segue, but anyway, I just wanted to point that out. I'm pretty pleased with how both these guitars sound, which is near identical. I would give the edge, I think, to the Epiphone because I think it has some sort of really nice creaminess to it, but then it also has like a really good howl to it when it's up loud. And I don't know why that is. The electronics are nearly identical, but that's just how it goes sometimes. Now recently Kirk had said his favorite version of all the Greeny replicas was this $1,500 Epiphone one. And I think since he said that, everybody's been wondering, well, what is so special about the Epiphone versus the $3,000 Gibson or the $20,000 Gibson or the $50,000 Gibson? I can't really speak for the higher end models, but I can say that there's a certain charm to this one that is missing on the Gibson. The Gibson's really fun, but it does feel like what it is, which is sort of a Les Paul standard with some Greeny appointments. Whereas I think you can tell that the Epiphone, even though it has some cheaper components to it, you know, like the veneer, things that don't really matter so much, it has a charm to it that really is hard to explain. It just plays different. It still sounds great like the Gibson. And I think just knowing that it's more derived from the real Greeny adds something to it. When you couple that with the fact that it is $1,500, which is a lot of money, but that's not a crazy sum of money, it's a pretty good steal. Now the Gibson is also something special as well. It's a high quality guitar, but let's be honest, it's a Les Paul standard, and you throw a couple $100 at it, put some Greeny buckers in it, spend $10 on mismatched knobs, you can kind of make this yourself. There's not really too much to this guitar that you can't put together by yourself pretty easily. Anyway guys, that's my review. I hope you liked it. I'll put some links in the description to some other stuff that I talked about in this video. If you did like the video, please like it and subscribe. Both those actions help me make more content like this. Thank you again. I'm Ben. I'll see you next time.